Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. There's an old joke about the little boy who was told to go wash his hands before supper. As he stomped down the hall, his mother heard him say, "Germs and Jesus, germs and Jesus. That's all I ever hear around this place, and I've never seen either one." Maybe we can relate. By the end of this week, I will have done 975 of these Pastor Gary Live episodes since the pandemic began in 2020. And while I intentionally try to vary my approaches and especially the topics I cover, one of my favorite themes to return to over and over again is to introduce you to some of the lesser known Bible people. Some Bible people and stories we know well, but there is a plethora of people in the Bible with important stories that we seldom encounter or know much about. If we have heard of them, we aren't likely to have spent much time thinking about their story and how it relates to our story or what God is doing through them. I really like exploring that and their lives with you. So my plan for this week is to do something a little like that. We know about some of the major prophets, people like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. These prophets have major and lengthy books in the Old Testament, and we tend to read from them fairly often in worship. But we also probably know that there are a number of smaller books at the end of the Old Testament. These books were written by folks who are called the minor prophets, and they are short little books that we hope the Sunday school teacher never asks us to try to find in our Bibles. These smaller books at the back of the Old Testament are not very familiar to us. We may have heard the names of these books, but most of the time, most of us don't have any idea what they are about. So my hope this week is to provide you with something of an introduction to these prophets and what they said. Now, I don't plan to cover them all, and in fact, I'm limiting our discussion this week to the last 5 books of the Old Testament. Today, let's meet Habakkuk. Now, I'm a Lutheran, and if you are too, Habakkuk may be one of those 5 minor prophets that you've heard of before. There's a verse in chapter 2 that Martin Luther used as a foundation for his ideas about justification by grace through faith, and about how the Christian relies on faith alone for salvation. More about that in a moment. There's not a whole lot known about Habakkuk the man. There are some things in his 3 chapters that can be used in Jewish worship liturgy, leading many to think that perhaps he was a priest who sometimes served in the temple, or that he may have been a singer or a musician at the temple. Even the origin and meaning of his name isn't known, with some suggesting that it comes from a word meaning embrace. We aren't even sure about when he preached, even though the best evidence seems to indicate that he preached during the rise of the Babylonian Empire in the time before they destroyed Jerusalem. That means that most likely he preached sometime between 609 and 598 BC. Habakkuk is a profound book, and it openly and honestly confronts the problem of why a just God is silent while the wicked swallow those more righteous than they. In other words, Habakkuk dares to ask the question we have all asked: why do bad things happen to good people? The first part of Habakkuk is a dialogue between the prophet and God regarding this issue. The answer Habakkuk receives is one that is eternally valid. God is sovereign, and in God's own way and at the proper time, God will deal with the wicked, but the righteous will live by their faith. That last part, the righteous will live by their faith, is found in chapter 2, verse 4, and it became a foundation block for St. Paul when he wrote Romans, and for Martin Luther as he began to grasp the idea that we are saved by God's grace through our faith. This important view of salvation has its roots here in the tiny, often overlooked book of Habakkuk. We also don't need to sweep by the other significant part of the discussion Habakkuk had with God, the part about how we live in faith amidst a world where evil exists. Habakkuk is urged to live in faith, patiently waiting God's wisdom for acting in the proper time. Habakkuk reminds us that we wait in trust of God. We wait, trusting that God does rule and that the wicked don't have the final word. That word belongs to God. There are two more parts of Habakkuk following this discussion, although they don't receive nearly as much attention. There's a long oracle, similar to many other prophets, and then a liturgical piece very similar to what we might find in the Psalms. Most of us pay attention to the first part that asks a question we still ask today and comforts us with the assurance that God does rule. Habakkuk is the prophet with the funny name, whose message is as fresh as it is as today. Live in faith. God still rules. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.